And today on the bench we have a realistic TRC-449. It's a 40-channel AM sideband radio.
14 right there, and down here in Louisiana.
So actually, it looks like a little bit of skips just starting to come in. The floodgates haven't quite opened up yet today. It's been dead quiet, but it's just starting to pick up. But and man, there is one hell of a glare there. There we go. Rid of that nasty glare. A little too shiny. So the customer sent this one in basically for, I guess you call it its 100,000 mile tune-up. So have all the electrolytic capacitors replaced, little maintenance things like that. It had a channel modification on the noise blanker switch. And he wanted that modification moved over to the CBPA monitor switch, so he can actually use the noise blanker. So turn it on and off. So in this video I just want to cover a few little maintenance items for radios like this. And what I mean by radios like this, I mean with the UPD 858 chassis. Probably the best AM sideband chassis produced, how should I put this, at a reasonable cost. It's not a CPI, it's not a stoner. So it wasn't, this isn't the ultra premium radios that just go for batshit crazy money. And honestly, from a user's perspective, these are probably better, because if you ever have to work on it, it's going to be one hell of a lot cheaper for starters to work on these. Secondly, replacement parts. You can still get most of the stuff for this one. And even if it's something that's not produced anymore, most techs are going to have parts chassis, so, if you need a variable transformer or coil or even a channel selector switch or something like that, there's a good chance they'll have it. If you have one of those ultra premium and also ultra rare high dollar value radios, if something goes wrong in one of them, yeah, you very possibly could have a brick on your hands because it may not be fixable. But of the solid state AM sideband radios, as far as Unidins are concerned, this is probably the best chassis they ever produced. A lot of people will argue, they like the later chassis, what replaced this chassis, and that's the chassis that's used like in Cobra 148s, Cobra 2000s, and any of the other, probably dozens of other similar radios that use that same chassis. This one's just better. It cost a hell of a lot more to make, a lot more expensive parts, but they did have some issues with the early radios. Now there's two generations of them. There's Gen 1 and Gen 2. Pretty much still all the same, but basically what happened was Uniden, came about. They wanted to get into, break into the radio market with a good sideband radio, and this was it. And it was a good chassis, but it had a few downfalls. So Cobra radios are known for having some issues. This radio's not. Cobra got early runs of the circuit boards, or they got the early chassis that were first produced. Companies like Realistic and a lot of the other companies didn't get their chassis until like 3 months or more later. Well, by then, Cobra had already been bombarded apparently with warranty claims for burned out finals and driver transistors and a few other little things. And Uniden quickly discovered the problem, fixed it, and all of the later radios, so all of the radios like this one, Realistics, all of those technical service bulletins that you need to do in a lot of the Cobra radios and some from the other manufacturers, they've already been done to this. They were done at the factory. So this one was fine out of the box. And the main problems they had with them was the bias circuits. They had the bias on, originally, and even if you actually look at the SAMS manual for the Cobras that first used this chassis, you'll see that even in the SAMS manual, they list the bias current for the final transistor as, I think it's 70 milliamps. It's a lot. And in this radio, if you look at the service manual for this radio, it's only 15 milliamps. What it should be, and that's when you do the technical service bulletin to Cobras and a lot of the other radios, Once you get done doing the service bulletin, that's what it is. You've basically converted it into this chassis right here that had already had the updates done to it. Really good radios. But, like I say, that's one of those things you should really do. As far as maintenance on these, I know I've said it before, always replace that tantalum capacitor right there. The original 10-volt one in there is known for shorting, and that's basically a tantalum capacitor's common failure mode is a dead short. So if you lose transmit, the first thing to look for is to replace that tantalum capacitor, because 90% of the time, there's a good possibility that's your problem. The other thing is, now some people will ask, should I replace the AM regulator in this? It's a common, I don't want to say it's a misconception, but they'll say to replace the TRC-449 AM regulator transistor in this with a heavier duty version. You don't need it. The only reason the thing burns out in these radios, and this customer actually specifically asked about that, should he upgrade it? Because he had read online, gotta love the internet, it's great for some things, but other times it's, if nothing else, it just confuses people because the information that gets out. But the main problem is the mica insulators that they used in these, and they didn't use much heatsink compound. The transistor just overheats. That's the problem. It's not properly, after 30 plus years of being in use, all that little bit of heat transfer grease that was on there, the thermal heat transfer compound, it's dried out and it's not working. And yeah, it is possible for it to go up. But I have never seen one burn up in a radio that was properly aligned and had either had fresh heat transfer grease applied to it or do what I do. I remove all of the mica and ceramic insulators in these radios and install the Barraquist sill pads. So all of these transistors, to include the driver, the final, transistor here, and another one right here, I install sill pads on them. They'll last forever. Or at least your lifespan. Nothing lasts, honestly, forever. But they'll live longer than you will. So you'll never have to worry about the thermal heat transfer grease drying out again. This doesn't have it anymore. That's all been replaced. Other than that, there's really not a lot you need to do. Now this radio does, and it was I think it was only the Realistics. It was what, 4 or 5 models, I think, from Realistic that had this chassis. It might not even be that many, honestly. I'd have to look it up in my notes. And a couple of the Cobras. The adjacent channel rejection is not as good as it is in some of the other UPD-858 radios. It's the exact same circuit board, but there's 2 parts missing. I don't know why they did it. Cost cutting? I don't know. I have no idea. But what is missing, and of course this big blob of wire is in the way, so you can't even really see it. Man, it is... Yeah, you can kind of see it. You see that piece of solid wire right there? That square silk screening on there, and then that empty little, like, half moon right there. There's a tunable transformer and a filter missing right there. So FT2 and L6 are not in this radio. That's the way it left the factory. This chassis, Cobra, 139 XLRs, like I say, there's a couple radios. Actually, I don't think it's 4 of the Realists. It's only a couple chassis. But for some reason, they didn't put them in here. So it's missing that one filter. Your biggest thing is you lose, like I say, a little bit of adjacent channel rejection. Other than that, it still has the good crystal filter. The rest of the radio is still the same. It's just, like I say, beyond me why they didn't put that in there. What they did install was that jumper wire. And that's the only parts if you have up. And the problem is you can't get those anymore. Those aren't made by Uniden anymore. So, if you want to install, if you have one of these radios and you want to install that to improve your adjacent channel rejection, you have to have a parts chassis. Now, the coils does not have to be the exact same one that was used in this radio. I think it's like I'm not even going to try and guess. I can't remember off the top of my head, but the Cobra 148 2000 chassis, one of the coils, or tunable transformers in that radio, it is the same transformer. It has a different part number, but it still has the same specs as the one that was used in this. So you can stick that and the crystal filters, that little filter, into these chassis. But like I say, you have to have a donor chassis to gut some parts out of, because they're not made anymore. Other than that, they're pretty much the same. They had a few, the realistic chassis had a few minor modifications in the AMC circuit. It is different than what's used in pretty much everybody else's radios. Still the same circuit board. They just changed the values a little bit. Used, oh God, how was it? They used a diode in place of a resistor. No, they used a resistor in place of a diode. And I think they changed the value of another resistor. Quite honestly, you can get 100% modulation out of one of these things very easily. A lot of people will tell you, yeah, you should take that resistor out, put the diode in, and change that other one to the same value as it's used in all of the other chassis. Honestly, you don't need to do that. I know why Realistic did it, to prevent overmodulation, and that's what I'm all about. Not splattering all over the RF spectrum. And honestly, you don't need to set these chassis. They're just loud chassis to start with. So even with the little bit, I don't want to say it restricts it, because it doesn't. You can easily get 100% modulation in one of these. What do I want to say? They just put a little bit more limiting circuit in this. There really wasn't needed, but you can still easily get 100% modulation, and they sound fantastic. So there's really no need to go doing anything with that. Good radios otherwise, but those are the main things. Probably the last thing is corrosive glue. Actually, there's two things: corrosive glue and the on-off switches in these. The corrosive glue, always, anytime you have one of these things in, remove that. Now on these radios, there's not really a lot on the top of this chassis. There's usually a little bit. These two toroid transformers, you'll find it in a few other little spots. There'll be a few little dots of it. Especially all of the large electrolytic capacitors, they have it around them. But other than that, it's not really bad. The glue that's down around the electrolytic capacitors isn't a problem, because you're going to be replacing those anyhow. So you can just take that glue out when you pull those electrolytic caps out. There's a new resistor here. There's a new polydip capacitor here. A few components I did replace, because when I removed the glue, because that usually oozes down, it gets all over the leads, and trying to clean that glue off of those leads, I don't know where you can see it, but that's bare copper now. The tinned leads, they're not tinned anymore. It's corroded through, and the resistor, you can see how gunky and gooped up that is. You're never going to get it cleaned off. Just replace them. They're cheap. I mean, what are you looking at? 2 cents worth of parts or less right there. So just replace them. The other side of the board, however, actually let me just turn it off, get it unhooked, and flip it over so I can show you what I'm talking about. Especially here at the back of the radio, all around back in here, every one of these ceramic capacitors on this board, they pour some of that glue around it to hold them in place so they can't move around. I doubt you're going extreme off-roading with a radio like this, but yeah, so lift up all of those capacitors and get that glue off, because it will actually eat through the overcoat on all of these copper traces, and it will start to corrode these traces. So, take that off. The last and final thing is the on-off switch in these. They're a little puny, but they're not. I'm not so much sure if it's even that they're that puny. I think the main problem was they were just prone to dirt. What would you want to say? Dirt ingress. So here is the original on-off control for this radio, and volume control. Now the customer stated this radio does not turn on a lot of times. You turn it on and it doesn't turn on. And actually, I never got it to turn on. I sat there and went like that, God knows how many times, and it never came on. Checked on one side of the on-off switch, because power comes in, goes to the on-off switch, and then turns the radio on. 13.8 volts on one side, and I had like maybe 300 millivolts on the other. Yeah, it was something ridiculous when it was turned on. The problem is the style of switch that they used. They used really small controls for starters, because just the way they had this laid out, they needed a smaller body control. And the one that they went with, now if you're familiar with potentiometers, all the resistive elements here. Normally, when you're working on a radio, you'll spray some cleaner in there because they're open. And that's one of the big problems is they're open. That's why volume controls, tune, squelch, clarifiers. That's why all those controls, when you turn them, you hear that? That's because dirt gets down in those gaps. The problem is with the on-off switch on this, it's exactly the same. Most controls that have an on-off switch, the on-off switch is encased. It's closed in. You can't get to it. This one is not like that. You can look down in there. You can actually even see the contacts. Get this just at the right angle. You can see the little contact flipping and making contact there. All it takes is one little tiny piece of dust to get in there between those contacts. It won't turn on. That's all it takes. And that's the problem. I actually have a toggle switch that came out of a... God, what did this toggle switch come out of? I think it came out of an All-Tech Research receive filter. But it's basically... But the reason I kept this was it was broken. Well, it just happens to still work, though. And basically what's inside of this on-off switch is the same thing here. Contacts broken, contacts engaged. There's no wiping action. It just comes in and breaks. Okay? The problem with that is there's really no way to clean it. Volume controls, or the potentiometer, or the resistive material, that's easily cleaned. Dirt gets in there, spray a little bit of cleaner in, but you have to remember, it's got a resistive material that looks kind of like a horseshoe on there, and then you have a wiper that actually rubs against it. So when you spray your cleaner in there, you can go like that several times, and it cleans it off. The problem with something like this is, you can spray some cleaner in there, but when you go like that, you're not actually moving the contact surfaces, abrading them against each other. They're just going like that. So yeah, you can spray cleaner in there and you might get a little dust particle out or something, but if there's any type of carbon or corrosion on those contacts, just going like that and putting some cleaner in there really isn't going to do anything. They would need to have abrasion. So honestly, this is a common failure point in these radios. A lot of these 858 chassis that have this style control, take this thing and do what I did. Take it out and throw it away. It's bad. Don't even try to fix it. What I replace it with is the same style control that's used in other unit-in chassis. It's a 10K pot, but it has a closed-in. You can see it's larger, physically larger. Okay? You see it has the terminals on the back. Just stick one of those in there, you'll never have a problem again. Volume control will last pretty much probably for the rest of your life, as long as you don't sit there and turn the volume back and forth, wear the resistance part out. But the on-off switch, you should never have a problem with it. These things are guaranteed to fail. They were just a failure waiting to happen, so that's another thing. Other than that, like I say, my favorite chassis. You just can't beat the UPD 858 chassis. Excellent receiving radios. They're quieter than the later chassis that replaced this. The big downfalls of this radios was, if I had to guess, I'd say there's two reasons this chassis actually didn't last very long. It wasn't around for a long time. Now, they sold a shitload of them, but honestly, it wasn't sold for that many years. But the reason that it didn't last very long was, for starters, expense. This thing was expensive to produce. Has a lot more expensive parts in it than the later chassis have. And you know how bean counters love to cut corners. And with cutting corners comes, reduction in performance and reliability. The other thing was the FCC, I believe. This had the UPD 858 PLL chip. The FCC really didn't like that UPD 858 chip because it was so easy to modify. And that and the PLL 02A of the same vintage, they went bye-bye and they started using other PLL chips. So, yeah, I think that was probably the two things that killed it. The PLL chip was too easy to modify, and it just cost too much. You look at the Cobra 148, take a matter of fact, actually, here's a, I don't want to call it a parts chassis, because it was a parts chassis. I'm actually occasionally when I get a few spare seconds, I tinker around with this thing trying to get it back up and running. But you can look in here and see Some of the parts that are not in here, that are in there, for starters, it doesn't have a relay. Now, actually, in all honesty, that's a good thing. Relays, it's mechanical, that's prone to fail eventually because it is mechanical. But honestly, they last a long time. I've got radios that original relays and they still work just fine. But you can see there's one transformer in this one. There's two in this one. Larger, professionally made crystal filter, which is a little bit narrower than the crystal filters used in these radios. And you can see these aren't professionally built in a sealed metal can. Nah, they just took a piece of circuit board material, slapped a few components on there, and kind of made their own. The boards actually, I think the boards are actually a little bit stronger in these. That's actually arguable depending on what vintage of 148 you're working on, because this chassis has been around for a long, long time, and has come in many different versions, different board materials. But yeah, just the components in this are not quite as good as what was in this. This one had better filtering, especially this crystal filter here. Like I say, it's a little bit narrower, so that really helps on sideband. But there you go. There's just a quick peek of the inside of a TRC, and there's that nasty glare back again. All that shiny chrome. Of a TRC-449 with a UPD 858 PLL chassis.